Welcome to Rethinking Death.life, the podcast where we flip the script on the spoiler alert. Everyone dies.
Hosted by the witty widowed death doula duo,
Kathy Dempsey
and Kim Harms.
We know our way around both life and afterlife prep. We tackle the big questions with humor and heart and a healthy dose of reality talk.
Whether you're planning your epic exit, pondering what's next, or just want to know if death really has a sense of humor, we've got you covered. Because rethinking death might just be the secret to truly living. Thank you for joining us today for an amazing topic that we're going to discuss with our dear friend, the doyen of death, Gail Rubin. Gail is an international speaker. She is an author, and she's someone that both Kathy and I admire greatly. And she's going to talk to us today about how to write a eulogy. So thank you so much for coming today. Gail, can you, we're so grateful that you're here. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks for being here, Gail. As we talk about eulogies today as the topic, what is the actual primary purpose of a eulogy, and how can a speaker ensure that they actually fulfilled that?
Well, a eulogy is talking about the person's life. One of the great things about funerals or memorial services is people come together from the various circles of your life. We all have multiple circles that we are involved in. And so a eulogy, a good eulogy, will tell that person's life story and help share information from all of these different circles of your life that bring them together. So somebody from your family might find out more about your speaking circles and friends, and vice versa. So one of the key things, though, about a eulogy is you want to honor the person, not the speaker. I have unfortunately been at funerals where, like, a son gets up to talk about his father, but in the process winds up talking more about him and what he's doing. Right. And you want to avoid that.
I'm laughing because I have been there a number of times. We have a very large family, and there are a few people in it that tend to do that. And it just, we all remember, and we laugh with them, actually, because, we realize what's happening. Sometimes they do it out of just grief and they don't know what to say, but many times it does come off like that. So that's a great tip.
Yeah. And how do you, because I've witnessed this and heard other stories from some of my friends and colleagues, but how do you deal with the person who's the speaker doing the eulogy, and they start talking about horrible things? I mean, it's got to happen a lot. I mean,
I don't know. I've never seen, the hook, pull them off the stage at a funeral. But you want to think about structuring, and it's not just the eulogy, but the entire memorial service event has a structure that can help make it a really meaningful and memorable event. There, what I call the 4 R's, and there's actually thanatology research that says these 4 R's really help make for a good memorial service or eulogy. You recognize, that's the first R, we recognize that somebody has died. And in fact, when I do a funeral service or memorial service, I will actually say how the person died, because, let's not dance around it. Did they live a good long life? Did they die by suicide? We need to say, yes, this person died. And very often that question will come up. How did they die? So let people know. Then we remember. So we recognize the death, we remember the person. This is when we tell stories where we, and a good tip that I've often used is think of 3 to 5 words that describe that person, and then build in a story for each of those words, those aspects of their life. Then we reaffirm beliefs. So this is a good time for the 23rd Psalm if they're religious, or if they're not religious, you want a physicist to speak at your funeral reading is a good choice. And then release. So recognize, remember, reaffirm, and release. We release the spirit of the deceased. We release the attendees to go back into their lives and to take the memory of that person with them.
And Gail, I'm so glad you mentioned to talk about how the person died, because I lost my mother and my son to suicide. And when I lost my mother back in the 70s, there was no service. No church would hold a service for her. She was a very religious woman, but in those days, that's how things were done. And it could not be more opposite for my son. We had thousands of people at his funeral at a Baptist church, including in his high school. We went to a Catholic high school. The high school kids came, even though he was no longer there. He had moved on to college, and they had buses and buses of kids coming to his funeral, including the band. And it was so wonderful that they did that. But we talked about suicide, and I remember a couple of parents coming to me, these young boys going off to school, failing at a romance and going into a depression. And I had several parents come to me that say, I'm going to get my son right now. We're going to check out. He's just broke up with his girlfriend. We're going to check out to see how things are going with him. And so I think it's very, very important, even in those, and it's one of the most difficult things to talk about is a suicide at a funeral. And but we need to do it. And I think it was very helpful. I had many people come up and thank us for making that a point in the funeral.
Nice. Yeah.
So Gail, how can you find the right balance between celebrating the deceased's life and acknowledging the loss?
Well, I think when you come to that part about reaffirming beliefs, that's a good place for balancing that idea of the loss and celebrating their life. But that can be woven through the entire service. Choice of music can be very uplifting as well as meaningful. Also, doing a photo display board so you can trace, the person's life in photos is a good way to also balance celebration and recognizing the loss.
So what are some of the do's and don'ts when incorporating humor into a eulogy?
Ooh. That can be very tricky. Definitely having humor is a positive when it works. And so you want to avoid humor that's poking fun at a particular person, but maybe, more of a lighthearted remembrance of this is what so-and-so would do. That could prompt laughter, but also a sweet memory.
Right. I think I did my dad's eulogy, and my dad just had the greatest sense of humor. He was a practical joker. And so there was people at the funeral that had my dad's jokes played on them. So just sharing some of those stories. In fact, my dad had a big thing about dyeing mashed potatoes green on all the holidays, especially Thanksgiving and Christmas. So for the reception, we had green mashed potatoes.
That's great.
And I remember at my husband's funeral, he had some of our nieces and nephews spoke, and we had played a big part in their lives when they were young, and they they talked about some of the escapades that my husband would get them into, some of the things that we were able to do back in the early 70s, the 80s and 90s that would be considered inappropriate now, like, letting him ride on the side of the car, the van, on the outside of the van. They'd be driving down the street on our little block and doing some of the fun things that he would let them do that you could no longer do. So that makes it even more funny now than it was at the time. So those really hit my heart, as his widow, that just remembering those fun times and the fact that he was kind of an adventurer and brought that to his rest of his family. So I think that was very helpful to me.
And one thing that as a certified funeral celebrant I do is I try to have a giveaway item for people to take or eat at the funeral. Like I did a service for a guy who loved hiking and he made his own peanut butter. So I had little packets of peanuts and gave them out to all the attendees and said, take a hike and eat the peanuts and remember so-and-so. I did a memorial service for a young lady who loved to bake. And so I got cookies, and it was just recently that I did this. And they had wreath cookies. So wreaths are emblematic, symbolic of eternal life and the cycle of life. So I handed out these wreath cookies to the attendees there, and they loved it. They ate them, ate them right on the spot.
Give us more.
Yeah.
I know I just went to a funeral a couple weeks ago, and they asked everybody to wear red to the funeral because that was the person that's died favorite color. So that was kind of like you were at a stadium of a football team. Everybody had red when you walked into the door. So
Yeah.
I had a friend that, dear friend of mine, who was known for her whoopie pie. She came from the Northeast, and she would bake whoopie pies for everybody, and she was just famous for that. And we had a talk. I was her cancer buddy. I would go to treatment with her, and she wanted me to hand out her recipe for whoopie pie. Not before she died, because she was not letting anybody have that recipe before she died. But at her funeral, we got the recipe for whoopie pies with a little picture of her, working with her grandson. And that was very memorable for all of us.
That's very nice. Yeah.
yeah. Do you have any ideas on how to handle or what advice you'd give somebody who is very emotional, that's given a eulogy, that maybe start crying or unable to really speak?
I would, say, take a deep breath. We're all speakers here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, if they're really upset, ask somebody to read what you've written. I'm assuming they would have written something.
Usually,
and
yeah.
if they're too emotional to deliver it, have the certified funeral celebrant read it for you.
Right. One thing, just as a speaker, not necessarily speaking at a funeral, but if I'm on stage and I get emotional, I just take a sip of water. And that somehow helps me just ground more, and then I'm able to go on.
Well, Gail, can you tell our audience where they can get a hold of you and some of the services that you offer and your wonderful, wonderful books?
Yes, I have books. I have T-shirts with snappy sayings like talking about sex won't make you pregnant, talking about funerals won't make you dead.
I love it.
But yeah, come to my website, agoodgoodbye.com, and you can email me, Gail, Gail, at agoodgoodbye.com.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gail. Wow, pleasure.
Great to be with you.